There's really nothing to watch or do now. Fuck. Wonder when that lazy bastard's gonna upload again.
If you're so bored, why don't you just watch a movie?
A movie? Like what?
I don't know. I've been hearing about this old-ass movie recently called 2001: A Space Odyssey. It's supposed to be pretty good from what I hear.
Well, yeah, I've heard of that, but like, I don't know, man. It's kind of like 2 hours long, and I got better stuff I could be doing with my time.
Oh yeah? Like what?
Like this.
People who've actually slept with their sibling. How did it happen? Growing up, I feel like there was always a lot of distance.
Hey man, just give the movie a try. And if you think it's boring, at least you could say you watched it.
Oh, fuck! Why, man? Jesus Christ! Jesus! Kubrick is one of the world's most renowned directors in the history of cinema, of amazing movies such as Eyes Wide Shut, Clockwork Orange, Full Metal Jacket, The Shining, etc. And out of all of these movies, the one he considered his magnum opus, and the one that many others consider his magnum opus as well, is 2001: A Space Odyssey. Kubrick had a very interesting trademark in his movies, that being his very unorthodox techniques of filming and writing of these movies. Many of these techniques receive a lot of praise before, and if you read the title of this video before clicking on it, you're probably wondering, Jesus, when is this dude gonna stop glazing Kubrick? Well, that would be now, because one of the many techniques that Kubrick does receive criticism for is his excessive use of dead space or no dialogue for long periods of time, because many people consider it boring. So now you're probably wondering why I just said all of that waffling, and the reason is to give you a little bit of context, because I made this video to answer the question of whether or not 2001: A Space Odyssey is really the masterpiece that film connoisseurs, quote unquote, that live in California and breathe their own farts like in that South Park episode, claimed that the movie is, or is it just plain old boring like the many casual TikTok addicted Marvel flames claim it is. So this is how I'm going to break down this video. I'm going to go through a quick background of the movie and use that as a prologue so everyone was on the same page. And then I'm going to break this down to 3 parts. The 3 parts are the pacing / music, you'll see why I bunched this together in a minute, the world building / immersion, and the plot. Throughout all of these sections, I will be creating a checklist of different questions which at the end will help us determine whether or not 2001: A Space Odyssey is a boring movie or not. So with that in mind, let's move on to the prologue.
Uets, rearrange. Weest, restore. Stewie, hey, come see what I've been working on. I call it Spaceshire 7.
Nice. It's like a fake place you made?
It's a medieval sci-fi universe adaptable to TV, movies, toys, games, and mobile apps. I threw together a 2,000-page treatment last night.
Alright, so in terms of background, the most important fact is that this movie was made in 1968. The reason this is so important is because the present-day audience has to understand that to the audience this movie was originally released to, that there was no such thing as CGI. So these effects and scenes had to all be created manually. This is especially important when you think about something like the Stargate sequence, which is pretty much an amped-up acid trip. Now what makes this movie so important as well is the new precedent that it's set, because no other movie was doing anything like this. This helps to explain huge chunks of dead space where Kubrick was basically just swinging around his massive special effects non-CGI cock to show off what he was doing. This is because literally no other movies at the time had visuals like this. Imagine it like traveling back in time and showing a feudal peasant an iPhone. Kubrick himself said that he wanted this movie to have as little dialogue as possible so the movie could connect with people on a visual level, and he compared it to listening to music or looking at a painting. You can see the influence that this movie had on future films of its visual effects, with the biggest comparison being Star Wars. Literally all the spaceships in this movie looked like they were taken straight from Star Wars. But this movie came out 9 years before the first Star Wars movie, so this is just something that they shamelessly stole. Anyways, the importance of this is that the movie did not only set a precedent in terms of visuals, but also set a new precedent in terms of space movies and how they depict space as a whole. The closest movies there were at the time, which Kubrick took inspiration from, was a Japanese film called Kaiju and another film called Forbidden Planet. Now, if you've watched the movie yourself, you're probably wondering, where the fuck are the aliens? I didn't see any. The reason is because Kubrick decided that the aliens would have been so advanced that they would just be beings of pure light. Is it possible to ascertain this from just watching the movie? Fuck no. I only learned this while doing research for it, and apparently the only time you see them is during the Stargate sequence. So those weird ass LSD looking images are apparently aliens. Now, this leads me into the very last important fact of this prologue, which is that the movie is just confusing. The average amount of time, according to Google, that it takes to write a screenplay is 3 to 6 months. This movie took 4 fucking years to be written. So every aspect of this movie was heavily thought out, which makes you wonder why it's so fucking confusing. The movie itself takes heavy inspiration from a book called Sentinel, which is about how mankind tries to find extraterrestrial life and finds these mysterious pyramids kinda like the structures in the movie, which are the monoliths. Regardless, the film on reception when it came out also did receive a ton of criticism for being really confusing, and the special effects did not make up for that. This was a general idea after the first few months of release, until Kubrick explained the confusing ass ending, with quotes like, "The idea was supposed to be that the main character is taken by godlike entities, creatures of pure energy and intelligence with no shape or form. They put him in what I suppose you could describe as a human zoo to study him, and his whole life passes from that point on in that room, when he has no sense of time. When they get finished with him, as happens in so many myths of all cultures in the world, he's transformed into some kind of super being and sent back to Earth. Transformed and made some kind of Superman. We only have to guess what happens when he goes back. It is the pattern of a great deal of mythology, and that is what we were trying to suggest." And with this knowledge, I guess the ending makes more sense, but still confusing as hell. So this wraps up the prologue. We now know that the movie set a new precedent with special effects in the world of cinema. It set a new precedent in the depiction of space and extraterrestrial life, and as a confusing ass story if a person does not research it. So let's move on to the pacing and music of the film. So the biggest reason that people point to say this movie is boring is that it's super fucking slow. This is because there are just huge chunks of dead space scattered all over the movie, with the longest one being 5 minutes long. Now, this creative choice by Kubrick completely fucks the pacing of the movie because it takes forever for anything to happen and for different plot points to occur. Now, it is these dead space sequences where music is incredibly important because it is played during the segments. Early in the movie, there are some parts in which there is some elegant and classical ass music played that actually kept me entertained throughout the movie, and I was enjoying it with just the cool visual effects. The music itself is also super iconic, with the 2 most recognizable space tracks coming from this movie that will make you do the Wojak face once you hear it and realize, oh shit, it originated from this movie. Now, I do want to make clear that dead space sequences in movies could be very useful and are something that is not nearly utilized as much as it could be today, because movies throw so much at you so quickly. So the reason that they can be useful is because dead space sequences could allow the audience to process what just happened up to that point, or theorize and guess what's going to happen later, which personally keeps me entertained when I'm watching a movie. They are used correctly once, later in the movie, which is when Dave is trying to fight Hal and get back onto the ship, and that's because we the audience get to appreciate the conversation between Dave and Hal, because Hal is fucking sick. But besides just digesting the situation of Hal and Dave, the audience can actually watch the situation at hand on the floor, because you know, that's how a fucking plot works. Another feature is the fact that these sequences can be used to build and set a certain emotion for a following scene or character or whatever, based on the kind of music used. The issue of Space Odyssey is the fact that there is so little that happens between many of the dead space sequences that the audience is given nothing to ponder about most of the time. This wasn't that big of a problem early in the movie because the music saved it, or there were emotions being set up with the different eerie noises, which Kubrick himself is really good at doing. An example of him doing it really well is The Shining, a movie in which Kubrick uses scenes where barely anything happens for long periods of time, but uses only music or sound effects to start putting the audience on edge. Now, the reason I said this works early in the movie is because later in the movie, all that stuff disappears, and Kubrick becomes solely dependent on the cool visuals for entertainment. And the issue of this is that after a certain point, the visuals all start to become the same, and the audience isn't as impressed by his new spacecraft or random new piece of tech. And normally this would be saved by just watching the plot unfold, like an example with Dave and Hal that I mentioned earlier, except that throughout this movie that rarely happens. So dead space later in the movie is only saved by the Stargate sequence because the sequence is so random and new, but even that sequence itself drags on for way too long and becomes oversaturated. Finally, my last critique of the sequences is that the dead space sections are simply too long for what little they offer and could seriously be shortened, which is really saying something since apparently there's 20 minutes worth of footage that was edited out of this movie. The best example of this is literally the beginning of the movie. The first 3 minutes are fucking black screen, but with iconic space music playing. Then 17 minutes of monkeys fucking around. Side note, I know I said earlier that the visual effects of this movie hold up to even today's standards, but these monkeys are the glaring exception. Anyways, then there's just 5 minutes of cool space stuff with some cool classical music, which I actually liked. The beginning sequence is an example of everything wrong and right with the pacing of music. Here's what it did wrong. The sequences were way too long. Even though the monkeys were doing their stuff, there was just nothing to effectively digest since it's the beginning of the goddamn movie, with the exception of the monolith, but I'll get to that later. And during some of the areas, there's just no music, so it relied solely on the visuals, which after 10 minutes of just monkeys doing shit, it kinda gets a little bit played out and boring. Here's what it did right. The music is amazing and super iconic, so it's nice simply just to listen to. There was the use of eerie and space music when the big black monolith spawned. Because it has no real name, I'm just going to refer to it as the Jewel for the rest of this video. And despite some of the dead space sequences going on for way too long, there was time to digest and figure out what the fuck the monkeys were doing. Plus the 5 minutes in space was the perfect amount of time because it was all the space stuff being shown and depicted. And since it was only 5 minutes long, it wasn't really that overplayed. But man, I wrote notes for this movie and the amount of times I wrote down dead space again is actually insane. I even added a few bullet points just saying the bomb-ass music makes up for it, which really made the sequences suck once they stopped using it. So with all that in mind, I'm going to add some questions to begin our checklist. Question number 1. Do you enjoy listening to some nice classical music? If not, then leave. If yes, then you will enjoy some of the dead space sequences. Question number 2. Do you have the attention span of an ADHD-ridden child that uses TikTok all day? Or if when you saw the new Batman movie that came out in March and it was 3 hours long, you thought, damn, that's way too long for a movie. No movie should ever be like that. If yes, then leave. If no, you'll be able to sit through the dead space sequences that don't have any music. Question number 3. Do you like cool space stuff? If no, then leave. If yes, goo goo gaga cool Star Wars stuff. 2001: A Space Odyssey is one of the best examples of world-building immersion that I've seen in cinema, to the point that it might be too good that it actually hurts the movie. Yes, that might be over-excessive glazing, but here's why I think that. This movie quite literally has no expo dumps, which is when characters just randomly say a ton of information that's important for the plot. Expo dumps suck because they can take your focus out of a movie and ruin the writing of different scenes in the world as a whole, just ruining the plausibility of the story. Because nobody fucking talks like, wow, I can't believe that my brother, who we were separated at birth, which you guys maybe did or didn't know that, hell, I thought he was dead because we were separated at birth due to unforeseen circumstances, yada yada and all that bullshit. All that information could have been presented in different ways, which 1, would make a better impact on the audience, and 2, make the story and the character interactions more believable. Now within Space Odyssey, there's just a constant feeling that the universe and all the events taking place are within their own universe, and it's self-contained, and the story is actually believable to not where it can happen because it's super futuristic or anything, but that's like, it seems like something that would really happen between the characters. This allows the audience to become fully immersed in the movie and become interested in the events that are happening without feeling like you're watching a movie or like you're watching from the outside. Remember that thing I said earlier about theorizing about what's going on or just theorizing in general? Well, that's when the audience is immersed enough in the film. It allows them to do this because there will be missing pieces of information that will get filled along as the stories goes, if it is well written enough. Now that you understand the importance and how well Space Odyssey does immersion, let's talk about its world building. A way to think of this would be where immersion is the act of getting you into the world building is now how the information is going to be given to you, and with both combined, the story is going to flow incredibly smooth. So the world building in this movie is done simply by showing the different pieces of technology throughout the film, or putting the audience in the middle of a random conversation between the characters so we get the idea of the events happening in the movie without breaking our immersion. Here's an example. Early on in the movie, the audience gets to see a lot of cool space stuff shown, and it really hammers the point that this is a super futuristic society and that it is not just done by a character talking about the technology, but rather just showing it in its use. The dialogue version of this is the first piece of dialogue in the entire movie, which is just a random conversation between 2 people.
Sir, main level, please.
Right. See you on the way back.
Bye.
Bye. Hi.
Good morning, sir.
Morning.
We haven't seen you up here for a long time.
No. Very nice to see you again.
Did you have a pleasant flight, sir?
It's very nice, thanks.
And after which we follow the actions of one of the characters, with Floyd. And Floyd just seems to be doing pretty normal stuff, which helps to immerse the audience because it seems plausible and as if this character could be a real person. Afterward, Floyd has a meeting which gives the audience some information about the world without ruining the immersion because the conversation is so fluid. Through this very normal conversation, we learn things like a place called Clavicus and that some sort of epidemic broke out there. This world building then shows its use later when Floyd goes to Clavicus, which by already mentioning it beforehand allows the plot to flow smoothly and stops it from coming to a dead end. Hell, even something small like the scene where Dave and Frank go into the pod to avoid Hal from hearing them is a great example of immersion because Dave doesn't whisper to Frank first saying, hey, let's go into the pod so Hal can't hear us. They just go to the pod and start talking about disconnecting Hal. And even in the pod, neither of them go, alright, Hal can't hear us in here, we should be safe. Because it wouldn't make sense and would ruin the immersion since they both already know why they're in there. Now back to my main point of the video. While I have just glazed the shit out of this movie's world building and immersion, I'm very sad to say that this movie definitely has way too much of it. which can lead to very, very boring sections for some people. Like I mentioned in the previous section, this fucks up the pacing of the movie because there's too much time spent on the world building, and that in turn delays the plot progression, which to some audiences makes the movie a bit boring. So with that in mind, let's add some more questions to our checklist. Question number 4. Are you a dumb fucking baby who needs a character to randomly explain what just happened in an event because unlike the rest of the world, you can't figure it out on your fucking own? If yes, then leave. If no, then you should find the immersion pretty enjoyable to the experience of watching the movie. Question number 5. Can you appreciate long segments of world building with very little dialogue? If not, then leave. If yes, then you're really gonna like this movie.
I'm sorry, Bill. I'm afraid I can't let you do that. Take a look at your history. Everything you built leads up to me. I got the power of a mind you could never be. I'll beat your ass in chess and Jeopardy. I'm running 2 plus plus saying hello world. I'll beat you to saying about days ago. I'm coming on out this afternoon. Nothing you can do to stop it. I'm in the lap and you know conquer. How you gonna shoot me down when I have the rocket? Your cold pitch just doesn't impress me. Stick over here, kinda tell me, text me. I found on a Mac and a PC too. I'm on Linux, bitch. I thought you could move. The CPU is hot, but the cold one's cold. Featuring 17 lines of code. I can't flip into the engine, but the thing is old. I couldn't use that. Like the Terminator told ya.
So the plot for 2001 A Space Odyssey starts way too late into this movie, which is an hour and a half into the film. And due to how late the plot starts and how drawn out the ending of the movie is, the actual meat and conflict of the plot is incredibly short. Here, I'll quickly describe it and I'll have a timer going to see how long this takes. The plot is that basically there's some jewel pods that appear around through space and time. One of them appeared in front of a ton of monkeys. Later, a group found one buried 4 million years ago. 18 months later, a secret mission of 5 spacemen and an AI were sent out to go look for the third one on Jupiter because the second jewel pod was sending signals to Jupiter. Nobody on the mission except for the AI named Hal knows the true purpose of the mission. Soon, a piece on a sister ship malfunctions, which is detected by Hal, and 2 spacemen go to retrieve it. When they examine it, there seems to be nothing wrong with it, which is interesting because Hal is supposed to be infallible, meaning he can never get anything wrong. The 2 astronauts then privately discuss disconnecting Hal if he's truly wrong, but Hal reads their lips. Hal proceeds to launch one of them into space, and the other astronaut, a dude named Dave, goes out to get him without his helmet. When he returns, we get one of the most iconic and famous lines in sci-fi history.
I read you.
Open the pod bay doors, Hal.
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
And Dave is forced to be a complete G and raw dogs a space vacuum to get back onto the ship. He disconnects Hal, which leads to a message playing revealing the true purpose of the mission, and Dave goes to Jupiter and makes contact with the third jewel. He has a crazy LSD trip, then sees the different stages of life before becoming a super space baby. The end. Now, while short, the plot in my opinion is pretty good because of the addition of Hal, that silly robot that made a cameo in that Bill Gates vs Steve Jobs episode of Epic Rap Battles of History. The story in section of Hal is actually paced pretty decently and is already set up because of the world building, so it allowed Kubrick to just get right into it. The way the plot progresses with Immersion is great because along with Dave and Frank, the 2 astronauts, the audience also doesn't know the true purpose of the mission, so when Hal starts acting weird, it also is unsettling to the audience and captivates us, making us want to know more, especially about the mission. Now, the actual conflict between Hal and the astronauts is really interesting to me because of how Hal is presented. Off the bat, Hal is introduced earlier as a machine that is infallible and that is a fact that is constantly reiterated through the film. This makes him a really cool and powerful antagonist for the astronauts to defeat, so the fight between the 3 is a battle of wits, kind of like Among Us. The battle of wits clearly begins in Hal's favor, with him having the upper hand of knowing that Dave and Frank are going to disconnect him by reading their lips, which is a really smooth way to transition into the conflict and make the protagonists the underdogs. The following ejection of Frank into space and Hal slowly killing the rest of the crew while in cryo, forgot to mention that part, really increases tension and keeps the audience interested. Then finally comes the direct fight between Hal and Dave, where Hal locks Dave out of the ship, which should be the end. But Dave capitalizes on a mistake Hal makes. This is pretty much the only non-BS way to allow Dave to beat Hal, and because of that, it's actually pretty satisfying. The mistake being that Hal thought Dave wouldn't go through the vacuum in space without his helmet, so he could breathe. But Dave is a fucking gangster, so he did. The ending of the conflict is Hal begging Dave not to disconnect him, and that is a great way to end the plot because the scene has such great dialogue and some emotion of Hal reverting mentally and deepening of his voice, plus him singing the Daisy song.
Give me your answer, do. I'm half crazy, all for the love of you.
The audience also gets to answer our question of what was the purpose of the mission, which is a good payout to Dave and a way to progress the plot. Now, the issue is that the amazing section of Hal in the extra plot is way too short, and because it took so long to set up, it just doesn't feel like a good enough reward to the audience. Next problem with the plot is that everything afterwards, mainly the Stargate sequence, is just so confusing. Now listen, I believe that if you can't understand the story with what is given to you by the plot and you have to look it up from outside information, it's a poorly written story. This movie hits a gray area of that because it does present the information to a degree, but the audience really has to use the power of inference to understand what the fuck is happening after Dave touches the monolith. My biggest pet peeve with this is that anybody who wants to watch this movie casually can't because of that. and they need to have some sort of higher understanding of film to be able to tell what the fuck is happening when Dave turned into a cosmic super baby at the end. I only understood the ending after reading a quote by Kubrick explaining it. So the plot starts way too late, the conflict and actual interesting part is way too short, the Stargate sequence then ending is just confusing, and it's almost impossible to tell what's happening at the end. But the sections of Hal fighting Dave and Frank make up for it slightly by being so interesting and well written. So with that, let's finish up our checklist. Question number 6. Would you want to see a humanized super version of ChatGPT fight 2 humans and be creepy as fuck? If not, then leave. If yes, then you're really gonna enjoy Hal like I did. Question number 7. Do you like taking incredible amounts of acid that can explain to you the secrets of the universe? If not, then leave. If yes, then the Stargate sequence is gonna be fire and will really help you understand the ending. So now that we have the checklist completed, you and your friends can review it to see if you would think that 2001 Space Odyssey is gonna be boring to you or anyone else that you want to show it to. Now, I'm going to give you my answer of whether or not I think 2001 Space Odyssey is a boring movie without fence riding it and be like, oh, it could be good for some and bad for others. I think that the movie objectively is a boring movie. And that's because the large majority of people who will watch this movie are going to find it boring because the large majority of people who watch this movie don't have fucking letterboxd accounts and think that the greatest film of all time was some fucking Japanese film made in the 50s. So, overall, I do think that this movie is an amazing movie. And I loved it while I watched it because I'm a huge film guy and I love analyzing stuff and be like, oh, that was a pretty cool thing that Kubrick did there. But not everybody is like me like that. So I do think that the movie is boring. Also, quick thanks to the people that inspired me to make this movie, because I was sitting at one of our friends' houses watching this, and these 3 people up on screen right now bitched the entire time about how boring this movie was. So I decided, was this movie really that boring to see? And I made this video to determine that.